Just a couple of points of housekeeping. This session is being recorded, and although you can see us, neither we nor the recording can see you. Peter and I are going to have a quick, have a discussion about reinsurance in a cyber context. There'll be an opportunity for questions and answers at the end. So if you've got any questions that occur to you as we're talking, feel free to enter them into the chat box, and then my colleague Harriet Strevens will pose those questions at the end. Any we can't answer, we'll try and pick up separately by email. My name is Neil Davis. I head up Mills & Reeve's cyber insurance practice, and our focus is on supporting insurers from a coverage and monitoring perspective when incidents are notified under cyber policies. Now, the majority of our appointments, as you'd expect, come from the insurance rather than the reinsurance market. However, the reinsurance market plays a significant role in shaping the cyber insurance landscape, yet we probably don't hear as much about it. I'm therefore delighted to be joined today by Peter Wedge. Peter's from Swiss Re, which, as you'll know, is one of the leading cyber reinsurers, and he's going to be offering a reinsurer's perspective on this fast-changing area. Peter, thanks very much for joining us today. Delighted to have you with us. Perhaps you could introduce yourself.
Yes, indeed. Good morning, everybody. Glad to have you with us today. My name is Peter Wedge. I'm the Reinsurance Contracts Counsel at Swiss Re. I'm part of the Swiss Re cyber team, and I'm actually the technical editor of a book on cyber, which is being launched today. It's called The Cyber Insurance Research Findings by the Insurance Institute of London.
How exciting, a book being launched this very day. And I should say that that is pure coincidence that that's the case. I'll give the book a plug a bit later on, if I may. Now, we'll start off with a nice, easy question for you, Peter. For those who might not be familiar with the concept of reinsurance, could you just explain briefly what it is?
Yeah, sure. I mean, very simply, reinsurance is insurance for insurance companies. So just as, say, Tesla wants to transfer the risk of a fire at their plant to an insurer, so the cyber insurers want to transfer a large part of their risk to the reinsurers.
Okay, so in theory, pretty straightforward, although, of course, the contracts that govern the transfer of that risk and the legal principles that underpin them are often somewhat more complicated, but fortunately, we're not concerned about that today. I am, however, interested to learn about the role which reinsurance plays in the context of cyber. How significant is the market?
Certainly. I mean, where cyber is concerned, the role of reinsurance, I think, is often underestimated. In fact, over 75% of cyber insurers transfer risk to reinsurers, and almost 60% cede half or more of their exposure. Of the whole market, about half the premium is transferred to reinsurers. That's roughly, for the reinsurers, $5 billion per year.
Okay. Just to give some context to that, how does that compare with the non-cyber market?
Well, only 10 to 15% of the insurance premium is ceded to reinsurers in more, let's say, mature lines of business, such as property or liability. So the cyber market is heavily reliant on reinsurance. And as a result, reinsurance, I say, are quite influential in driving some of the underlying market dynamics. Of course, there's been an increase in demand for reinsurance, and to some extent, the reinsurance terms and conditions are molding the market. However, it's a bit like kind of driving a car from the back seat of a car. The cyber insurance market is actually dominated by a few large players, and the reinsurance follows a similar pattern. So, for example, the top 5 writers of cyber reinsurance have something like 65% market share.
I particularly like the analogy of driving from the back seat. From what you're saying, the insurance market's transferring a much larger proportion of the risk to the reinsurance market than is the case for more traditional lines. So that begs the question, how do reinsurers view the cyber insurance market?
I think you can say that some reinsurers are bullish about the peril of cyber. They view it as an exciting opportunity that offers significant potential for premium growth, since awareness of cyber risks is increasing. Standalone cyber insurance is one of the fastest growing sectors of the insurance industry. And in the next 5 years, various sources estimate that it could reach more than $25 billion in premiums from around $4 billion in 2018. and it had very good loss ratios, essentially in the 40s before 2019. 2019 and 2020 have actually been more difficult in terms of profitability, I would say.
Okay. And you mentioned that some reinsurers are bullish. What about others? Is it true of them all?
So I would say no. I mean, some of the reinsurers are quite cautious. They are worried about the same cyber incident affecting thousands of policyholders and hence triggering multiple covers, or perhaps many large unrelated cyber events occurring in one calendar year or reinsurance period. This could lead to severe capital depletion, for example.
So what you've just described is, I think, sometimes referred to as aggregation or accumulation of risk. And I know it's something which is a concern to insurers and reinsurers alike. From a cyber reinsurance perspective, what factors mitigate against a severe risk of accumulation?
I think there are many. Let's go through some of them. Number one, it would be there's a limited attack motivation. Essentially, generally speaking, the hackers want profit, not terror. And the state-sponsored attackers will be caught by law enforcement if they are too successful. The second point is that the take-up rate of cyber insurance is quite low. So if there is an attack and people are affected, many of them won't actually be insured. Arguably, there has never been a catastrophic cyber incident in terms of insured cyber losses. There's been no large systemic losses going through the market, and the dreaded accumulation has never occurred in practice. I think the closest call was NotPetya attack in 2017. Instead, there have been large cyber losses such as Capital One and frequency losses, especially ransomware recently, which are targeted attacks of organized criminal endeavor and not a systemic loss. The next point is that reinsurers can effectively control the accumulation by way of the reinsurance contract, for example, capping a quota share reinsurance contract and setting reasonable limits in excess of loss protections, which aren't so common anyway. So I would say as a result of this, the total loss from cyber for any given reinsurance contract is in some way capped. And the last point, I mean, so far the silent cyber losses have been manageable, and some reinsurers have recently, basically last year or year before, required cyber exclusions for property and engineering covers.
So silent cyber, that's a term that crops up a lot in an insurance context as well. Could you just explain briefly what's meant by that?
Yeah, so very briefly, silent cyber or non-affirmative cyber, it's basically cyber risk exposure, which relates to potential insurance coverage for cyber risks in what we may call traditional insurance lines. These might be property, engineering, marine, energy, aviation, and liability policies, which may inadvertently contain ineffective or ambiguous cyber risk exclusions. Alternatively, some policies may provide cyber coverage because there is no specific cyber exclusion, and the cover is unintentionally too broad. These ineffective exclusions may fail to deny coverage for at least some types of cyber risk, despite the underwriter's intention to exclude such risks. Since these cyber risk exposures were unintentionally underwritten, no premium was charged to the insured because the insurer did not expect any cyber losses when pricing the risk.
And you mentioned a moment ago the NotPetya incident as being, I think your words were, perhaps the closest accumulation event that the cyber markets experienced. Could you tell us a little bit more about that incident?
Yeah, sure. So the NotPetya cyber attack in 2017, it used the Eternal Blue exploit, which was previously discovered in older versions of the Microsoft Windows operating system. When NotPetya was executed, it automatically encrypted all of the files on the infected computers and, importantly, replicated itself to infect local computers on the same network and any remote computers it could find. This means computers for the same company all over the world were suddenly out of action, creating severe business interruption. Importantly, every method of exploitation that the attack used to spread was preventable by well-documented means. The attack actually targeted Ukraine, but in fact, it infected hundreds of companies globally, including some like Maersk, FedEx, Merck, and Mondelez. And it resulted actually in $10 billion of economic losses and $3 billion of insured losses, of which 2.7 billion was silent cyber.
So obviously, with the potential for such significant events and risk exposures, getting the policy wording right is a key consideration for insurers and reinsurers. What about the interpretation of reinsurance contracts in the context of cyber?
I think it's fair to say there is legal uncertainty in the interpretation of the insurance and reinsurance contracts that respond to cyber incidents. In simple terms, because it's a new class of business, so few cases have reached the courts, and hence the courts have not provided decisions that can be used in future cases. In addition, in many countries known as civil law jurisdictions, there is simply no reinsurance law. There is only insurance law, which does not apply to reinsurance. This is a little known fact, but it is significant. Furthermore, the language used in reinsurance contracts is not standardized, and interpretation becomes even harder across a whole portfolio.
Yes. I mean, that lack of precedent about how terms in a cyber policy will be interpreted is certainly something I recognise from the coverage work that I do. And whilst often you can apply general insurance principles, there's still quite a lot of language used which is unique to cyber and so untested. And I think it's going to be some time before we get real clarity. Aside from that uncertainty around contract interpretation, what are the main challenges for reinsurers in the cyber arena?
I mean, I think there are several, but I shall just identify two. The first one would be basically identifying, quantifying, modeling, and managing the cyber accumulation risk, both silent cyber and affirmative cyber. And the second one would be building a balanced portfolio of risks in terms of such things as types, size of original insureds, and the geographical split between North America, Europe, and Asia in order to get diversification.
Okay, and when you talk about balanced portfolio, I presume that's intended to try to ensure that all your eggs aren't in one basket, and that's another method, presumably, of managing your exposure to cyber risks. And in doing that, as a reinsurer, you're presumably deciding where you deploy your underwriting capacity. Now, given the explosion in growth of the cyber insurance market and the hardening market conditions, I've seen a lot of reports to the effect that there's a real issue on the horizon regarding underwriting capacity. What are your views about that?
Yes, that's right. And as of 2022, there is probably insufficient cyber reinsurance underwriting capacity. Some reinsurance protections have not been fully placed, but I think the brokers would have a more complete picture, of course. Recently, there has been very limited new reinsurance capacity coming to the market, and even fewer offering retrocession protection, i.e. reinsurance or reinsurance. Hence, the status quo is unlikely to change for quite some time. However, there are several insurers who would like to transfer more of their cyber risk exposure and original insureds who would like to do the same. There is some talk of companies looking to secure capacity from insurance-linked securities, but in short, there is a hard market at the present time for cyber on both the insurance and reinsurance side.
Thank you for reminding everybody what a retrocession is. Now, that's been a really interesting perspective on some of the issues and challenges that confront the cyber reinsurance market. And many of them are perhaps unsurprisingly echoes of the issues and challenges which affect the insurance market. And in that context, one of the really hot topics for cyber insurers, and therefore presumably also for reinsurers at the moment, given current world events, is the much discussed series of cyber war exclusions, which the LMA have recently published. What are your views about these?
So in November 2021, last year, the LMA introduced 4 new clauses which try to exclude cyber war in addition to what we may call traditional war. These exclusions, the LMA 5564, 65, 66, 67, they use similar concepts and structures, ranging from the removal of coverage if due to war or nation-state cyber operations, to exceptions made for nation-state activity that falls below a certain threshold. I would say the exclusions have not gained traction in the cyber market, having only been used on a couple of placements, and Swiss Re is still considering their position on these particular clauses.
And why do you think it is that they haven't really gained traction?
I mean, I can't answer that question directly. I mean, the market is made up of many players and it can change very quickly. But I would say, Marsh, for example, the biggest broker, have stated in a recent article that these new cyber exclusions may increase uncertainty, and I quote, "Collectively, the new exclusions introduce and rely on a number of ambiguous terms, such as major detrimental impact and essential services, that currently have either an ambiguous threshold, an unclear meaning, or no ordinary interpretation. It is also potentially problematic that the exclusions introduce the term cyber war, but do not define it." And I would say Marsh also sees several deficiencies in the big problem of attributing a cyber attack to a sovereign state. I mean, that said, no cyber attacks today have ever reached the level of cyber war. And I think there's never been the triggering of a war exclusion on a cyber policy. Other attacks, like the solar winds, for example, is actually state espionage and hence should not trigger the war exclusion. Under international law, espionage is actually not war as such. So a cyber policy only covers digital risks, non-physical risks. And we have court cases to interpret physical war exclusions, but only one in the context of a cyber attack, Merck. But in fact, that was in the context of a property policy, going back to silent cyber.
So from what you're saying, it seems we may be some way off from these clauses being routinely adopted. And then, of course, there's the question of how they're going to be interpreted. But that's possibly a conversation for another time. Peter, you've taken us through an extremely interesting account of the reinsurer's perspective of cyber today. And before we wrap up, I wonder if I could just ask you for any final observations which you feel might be helpful to those operating in this market.
I mean, I would say generally that the cyber product is in its infancy, and we can expect the product and the associated claims to, of course, evolve over time. Some of the current challenges are, for example, I would say claims inflation, shortage of capacity we mentioned, the reliance on reinsurance, perhaps the shortage of talent, the lack of commonality in wordings, risk standards and risk information, and perhaps over-reliance on pure price change. You could say that the cyber product is structured as a third-party product, but is largely first-party.
And just pausing there for one moment, could you just explain why you say that it's structured as first-party rather than third-party product?
It's actually structured, I said, yeah, sorry, as a third-party product.
Apologies, yeah.
What I mean to say is that essentially, normally you would have a property policy, that's basically covering your first party. And then something like liability would cover your third-party liability. And in a nutshell, the cyber product has both of those elements. You've got the first party, so losses to yourself as a policyholder, and then basically your liability to third parties. And because of that, it's quite an unusual kind of product, which has basically grown up over time. And because of that, you have lots of different claims. For example, the data breach is more on the third-party side. Ransomware tends to be more on the first-party side. But lots of claims are basically developed, which probably many people didn't expect. That's quite tough.
You mentioned the challenges. What about the opportunities?
I think, given the growing demand for cyber insurance and kind of ubiquitous presence of cyber perils in our daily life, I think those insurers who can gain sufficient expertise and the right product can really reap the rewards for many years to come. Right,
well, looking at the time, we've got an opportunity to take some questions for the audience. So thank you very much, Peter, for your comments so far. I'll now hand the baton over to my colleague Harriet Strevens. She's been monitoring the questions we've been getting. Harriet, do we have anything for Peter?
We do indeed, yes. I'll start with my first question, if I may. You say, Peter, that we're operating in a hard marketplace just now. Has this had an impact on the number of disputes now being addressed between insurers and reinsurers, would you say?
No, I would say it hasn't in that sense, because the underwriting relationship between insurers and reinsurers is very, very close. Essentially, it's really dominated in the cyber world by this, what we call the Quota Share. And that means basically it's kind of a partnership. So you basically take a percentage of the premiums, percentage of the losses, and that would be quite different to if the dominant structure of reinsurance was excess of loss, where you just respond to losses above a certain threshold. Then you have basically different interests between the insurer and the reinsurer. And with a quota share, I would say you're closer together. You try to work as a team. And although, of course, you have different perspectives, basically, in general terms, if the insurer makes money, you make money. So that's really how it works. And also, basically, with reinsurance, you've got repeat customers all the time. It doesn't really pay you necessarily to fall out with some of your biggest customers, because if they walk away, you have a limited market.
Yeah, I appreciate that. You may have answered this next question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, in what you've just said. What are the main types of reinsurance policies cedants purchase? Is it just quota share, the questioner asks, as you mentioned, or are there others?
So essentially, according to my research, it's around 95% of the market could be quota share as we stand at the moment. It's quite difficult to get the whole picture because, of course, we're just Swiss Re. We can also talk to the brokers. That I got that figure actually from Gallagher Re, who's one of the main brokers. But it can change quite quickly. So let's say you have certain companies want to have excess of loss protection, say for catastrophe exposure on cyber. If they have lots of layers and lots of big limits, then that could change from the 5% excess of loss. It could change to say 10, 15, 20% quite quickly. At the present time, there's less appetite for these catastrophe cyber covers. Of course, because you can understand you're basically covering the very thing that could be most severe, most dangerous for reinsurers.
Yeah, so it's a movable feast, isn't it? You gave the analogy of driving from the back seat. Do you see reinsurers driving a restriction in coverages being offered under direct policies, at least in the next 2 years, as we look to grapple with improving loss ratios, would you say?
I think all you can do is basically whisper in the ear of the large insurers and try to influence them. And basically all the unofficial channels. You can't really tell them what should be in their policy. That's up to them. You can say that you don't like certain elements of it, but again, it's a separate business. And essentially the ultimate would be to walk away, right? To say, well, we can't support you given this structure and given this policy language, but it's probably unlikely that you would do that. But it is a hard market. Let's see how this plays out. Yeah,
no, I'd agree with you there. Well, we've now come to the end of our allocation for question time, so I'll pass back to Neil, and any others that we haven't answered can be dealt with by email.
Thanks, Harriet. Thank you very much indeed, Peter. I think it's been a really interesting session today, and really interesting to hear from a reinsurer's perspective. So thank you very much indeed. I did promise to plug your book, which comes out today, and as I say, the timing was genuinely pure coincidence. It's called Cyber Insurance Research Findings, and as I understand it, it offers an overview of cyber threat before concentrating on coverage currently available, pricing, monitoring, accumulated exposure, and risk management and claims. It's available from the Insurance Institute of London website. I've already ordered my copy, and I hope that many on today's webinar will do likewise. That's it for today. We hope that you found this session interesting, and we look forward to seeing you again at our next cover talk, which is on Thursday, the 14th of July, when my colleague Andrew Tobin is going to be delivering an introduction to credit and political risk. Please do take the time to fill in our questionnaire, which will pop up on your screens at the end of this presentation. It's really helpful to us to understand what you'd like to listen to. Thank you very much for joining us today, and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.